So it's our pleasure today to welcome Shayegan Omidshafiei, who is a research scientist in the People in AI research team in Google Research, where he works on interpretable and human-in-the-loop reinforcement learning. Before joining Pair, Shayegan was a research scientist in DeepMind, where he worked in the game theory team and co-led their sports analytics effort. Shayegan's research interests include multi-agent RL, game theory, interpretable RL, robotics, and control systems. He previously received his PhD at the Laboratory for Information and Decision Systems and Aerospace Control Laboratory at MIT, specializing in autonomous systems. He also received his SM degree in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT in 2015, and his bachelor's in science degree in engineering science from the University of Toronto in 2012. He's the co-inventor of 5 patents filed with the United States Patent Office and co-author of the book AI for Sports, which I now need to pick up. Yeah, we're really excited to have you here today and looking forward to your talk. So if you want to take over from here.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's great to be here. Yeah, I've been also very much wanting to join this meeting, every time it happens, but yeah, you know how it is at Google, the calendar is often very overloaded, but I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, so today's talk is going to be focused on multi-agent behavioral analysis. It's a bit of a step back from the kind of typical moral papers that I've been working on. Maybe we kind of usually see on performance-driven multi-agent RL, and this is more about deriving techniques for understanding interactions between agents, really kind of understanding different behavioral clusters, and trying to gain insights from analyzing all the data that we generate throughout the model training process, kind of in a post hoc fashion. So before I delve into the actual the technical details of the talk today, I just wanted to give a bit of a kind of high-level perspective on some of the research works I've done alongside colleagues from DeepMind and Google in the past that touch kind of this space of multi-agent system understanding and kind of interaction of agents. So one of the earlier examples of this was our work on AlphaRank at DeepMind, where we were focused on trying to understand interactions of different agents in many player general sum games, and basically deriving a new solution concept as a potential alternative to things like Nash equilibria and correlated equilibria that allowed us to kind of gain insights into what might be strategically dominant strategies in these general sum type of settings. And so there we were using techniques from evolutionary and empirical game theory to introduce this new method called AlphaRank that allowed us to do this kind of analysis. And then as a follow-up to that, we ended up extending this AlphaRank framework to not just analyze strategies in individual games, but to actually understand relationships between multiple games. And so we used AlphaRank as a means of computing essentially like a latent space over games as a whole, which allowed us to compare and understand similarities and differences between games ranging from very canonical normal form settings like rock, paper, scissors through sequential games and kind of more traditional games that are maybe used in multi-agent RL and game theory these days, like Go, tic-tac-toe, kind of sequential games of different sizes. And then following that, we had some work at DeepMind as part of the sports analytics effort on not understanding agents that are trained via RL, but actually understanding multi-agent systems involving humans. So here we introduced a new method called the graph imputer, which used graph neural networks to model and understand kind of behavioral characteristics and interactions of humans on the soccer field, especially in settings where they might be visually occluded, or if you have, let's say, like a camera that is following them and you're kind of missing information about players that are off screen, essentially solving a multi-agent time series imputation problem using this method. And then more recently on this space of multi-agent system understanding, my intern Nico Grupan and I and colleagues Natasha, Jacques, and Bing Kim worked on developing concept-based understanding of multi-agent behaviors. So here the core idea was, what if we now inject concept bottlenecks into the policies of the agents and ground these concepts in things that are understandable by humans, which then enables us to post hoc visualize these concepts and how they correlate to the decisions made by the agents, but also importantly allows humans to step in and maybe make corrections to misestimations of certain concepts or conduct counterfactual analysis of these concepts and see how changing these human understandable concepts affects the behaviors of the agents in the environment. And I think Nico actually gave a talk to this group on this as well a few months ago. So that was kind of the past work leading up to this this talk. Today's talk specifically is going to be focused on a recent NeurIPS paper that we had called Beyond Rewards, a Hierarchical Perspective on Offline Multi-Agent Behavioral Analysis. And this was work that was done with my colleagues, Andrei Kapishnikov, Yannick Asogba, Lucas Dixon, and Bean Kim. So I think as many of you, if not all of you know, behavioral analysis plays a really key part in multi-agent research, even like performance-driven multi-agent research, right? So identification of the kind of interesting emergent skills that happen in these complex environments is often highlighted in moral research and in papers. But usually this requires quite a lot of hand-holding and expert knowledge and manual monitoring of our agents. So here's kind of a famous example of this. This is the OpenAI hide-and-seek domain. And in the paper, the authors, in addition to their usual kind of reward curves, they had gone through different trajectories and manually annotated different behavioral regimes that emerge throughout the training process. So for example, here in the early phase of training, the agents were just conducting running and chasing behavior. So the seekers were just running after the hiders directly. And then in the next phase, the hiders learned how to use different objects and build forts around themselves to protect themselves. And subsequently, the seekers best respond to that and learn how to use ramps to get in the forts, and so on and so forth. But the kind of key thing here is that, despite a fairly smooth reward curve, we have very clear kind of behavioral change points occurring throughout training where really interesting emergent behaviors kind of pop up. And then similarly, in some of the work that we did at DeepMind on using MuJoCo to train agents to learn how to play football, we had done some manual analysis in addition to our kind of usual sports analytics and statistics that we gathered to monitor training progress. We also did some manual analysis to highlight different kind of interesting interactions that popped up in the agents throughout training. So for example, agents learning how to jostle each other, different types of passes that emerge, different kind of acrobatic maneuvers that the agents use to interact with the environment and so on. And this was also similarly done with some of DeepMind's work on capture the flag a few years ago, where different phases of training kind of emerged, where in the early phases the agents just learn the basics of the game, then they learn how to navigate, and finally they finish off with really perfecting their strategy and memorizing different aspects of the environment. But I think one thing that is consistent when we take a look at all of these works is that reward as a signal is not sufficient for just doing behavioral analysis. So reward might be enough for us to train and enable the emergence of really interesting and complex interactions. But once we go post hoc and really want to understand those interactions, the reward curves are not sufficient anymore. And so here is a really simple demonstration of that in a 3-agent hill climbing environment. So this is an environment where we have these 3 agents, the circles, operating in a 2D continuous grid world. And in this grid world, they're basically trying to navigate, and they receive dense rewards on these 3 hills. So the reward space is being visualized here. There's no direct interaction here, really just 3 agents kind of independently trying to figure out how to navigate in this world. But it's a simple environment that serves as a nice kind of sanity check for us to kind of understand the different type of behaviors that can emerge, right? So if we train with some standard RL algorithms on this domain, and let's say we run a bunch of different sweeps, different hyperparameters, different seeds, we might have a few training curves, different trials, A and B, for example, that have really similar return curves, right? And even the final return from these 2 trials is nearly identical. But then if we grab the checkpoints that come at the end of this training, and we actually roll out these checkpoints, and in this case, the policies of the agents being deterministic, the behaviors that the agents exhibit are vastly different between these 2 trials. So in trial A, basically 2 of the agents prefer to go to this bottom left hill, and 1 agent goes to the right, whereas in trial B, that changes. Right, so even looking at similar return curves, we can have wildly different kind of behavioral characteristics emerging. I mean, in this case, there's also a lot of symmetry breaking and things happening. So it's kind of like maybe a corner case, but we can see kind of a softened version of this happening in more kind of complex type of settings too. So the objective of this particular
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Oh yeah, sure.
Could you just explain a little more what we were supposed to get from that last slide? I feel like I didn't get the point. I missed it.
Oh, the point is that just purely looking at reward curves tells us almost nothing about the actual behaviors of the agents themselves. So it would be nice if we have some kind of additional maybe visualizations or techniques that can tell us a bit more about the general behavioral emergences that happen.
So in particular, in this example, what you're saying is that even though the reward is high, even though the reward goes up, we can't tell which hill the agent's going to go to. Is that the issue?
Yeah, and even though the reward is similar between the trials, yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Wait, I have a question. You're saying reward is not enough. What I'm trying to guess what you mean. You mean not that you want to replace the reward for motivating the agents, but for observing the behavior of the agents.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's basically the objective of this work is we'd like to automate the detection and visualization of these types of emergent behaviors in multi-agent systems. And there's a bunch of different potential benefits of doing this. So one benefit is that it might provide us a means of qualitatively comparing different types of multi-agent behaviors, right? So we can have maybe comparisons of different algorithms, not just in terms of the reward, but also in terms of the different types of agent behaviors that they induce throughout training. And maybe we can use this as a measure of behavioral diversity induced by different algorithms or different kind of sets of hyperparameters for these algorithms. Another use case for this would be to detect anomalies, both at training time and also at test time. So we already had that example of the hide and seek environment where there were multiple behavioral change points that were manually specified throughout training and manually kind of found throughout training. But wouldn't it be great if we could actually automate that type of change point detection? And then also in some of these systems, we might actually at test time have kind of interactions of the agents with brand new other agents or even with humans. So imagine if we used RL to train like a recommender system for, let's say, YouTube. New users might interact with the agents and some new types of behaviors might actually emerge as a result of that. And so understanding these kind of behavioral change points can be useful in that sense too, to try and understand kind of like how do the agents actually end up interacting with users. And then finally, this type of behavioral analysis could potentially be useful for improving subsequent agent training as well, right? So one idea there is we can actually train meta policies over this behavioral space rather than at the primitive action space of the agents. And then another example there is, imagine if we can see in this behavioral space some behaviors that are perhaps like competitive or adversarial that maybe we actually don't want our agents to ever exhibit in future training runs. So if we have a grasp over this behavior space, we can actually feed back information, maybe as a reward signal, kind of condition on the behaviors that we observe to disincentivize these types of behaviors from popping up again in future training runs. So kind of a slew of different benefits there. So that was kind of a high-level introduction and motivation for this work. Now, how do we actually formulate this problem? So here we're considering state action trajectories over a set of n agents. So we have a trajectory tau, which is composed of a sequence of states and the actions coming from our agents I that connect them all together. Right? And our goal is to discover agent behavior clusters given a data set of these trajectories. And then a few kind of points to make here before moving on to the details. So one note is that we specifically focus on state action trajectories here rather than state action reward trajectories, because this can actually mean that we can apply the techniques that we derive to data that's been generated potentially without even reliance on a reward function whatsoever, right? So this could include things like human-robot interaction data, where human doesn't necessarily have a reward function that they can expose to us, or even human and human interaction data. So imagine like self-driving cars on the road, or interacting with humans, and maybe we're kind of modeling human driving behavior using these techniques first before we deploy our cars. Or maybe agents that are using kind of curiosity-based exploration techniques, like a mix of reward signals and other kind of signals. And then in terms of the data set itself, the data that we're considering here could potentially be collected not just at the end of training, but also throughout all of models training, right? We want to kind of understand the behavior of these agents emerging over time. And also this data could include, sweeps over different hyperparameters, multiple algorithms, obviously different seeds and so on. So it's a very diverse data set that we're considering.
I have a question.
Yep.
So are you assuming that the state is in some sense fully observable?
In this case, yeah. We're
Which would
assuming
be
the state.
a little tough with human interaction data, maybe.
It's true, yeah. I guess in the human case, I mean, we can all, kind of move into that POMDP setting and kind of consider any observations from kind of external observations that we get as observations of a hidden state. So in terms of the formulation itself, we're basically looking at a multi-agent MDP in this instance. So we have our state, which are fully observable. We have our agents, which are running decentralized policies, so policies dictating the actions they take as a function of the state. Obviously, these actions are going to drive through kind of forward the trajectories that we're gathering here in individual episodes. And as mentioned earlier, the data we're considering here is highly diversified because these policies are changing throughout training, right? So the data we're collecting is coming from policies that are non-stationary and also could be coming from multiple different algorithms, hyperparameter sets, and so on.
And just to understand the setting again, the policy is known, the policy is learned, or what's?
Policy is learned. Yeah, the policy will be learned. The only thing that is known as input are these raw state action trajectories.
Okay, so the policy will approximately generate things from the distribution of trajectories we see.
Exactly.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so actually leading into that, so what is a process that could kind of approximate this non-stationary change of policies throughout the training process of the agents? Well, let's consider a hierarchical latent process. So at the top level, we have this joint latent variable z omega, and this variable is essentially being used to encode, let's say, the type of coordination that the agents are exhibiting. Right, so this z omega could be telling the agents, hey, you need to be behaving in this kind of cooperative manner or this competitive manner, or kind of like whatever the type of team level or multi-agent level interaction is happening is somehow being captured by this z omega. And then conditioned on z omega, each of the agents has its own local behavioral latent vector, right? So based on the team level behavior that is meant to be exhibited, here are the individual behaviors that each of the agents should exhibit being encoded in Z alpha. And then now we have this latent condition policy for each of the agents. So pi being not just a function of the state, but also on the particular agent's Z alpha vector, right? And then the process kind of follows through from this point on. So now under this view, the probability of a trajectory tau in our data set can be decomposed as follows. So kind of pretty standard decomposition here. We have an initial state distribution, the state transitions, but then we have these additional terms now popping up. And the main approach here is that we like to learn this distribution over the joint and latent local distributions, the latent local variables, as well as this latent condition policy, right? So these three terms are all being learned. And we'd like to learn the distribution over these that maximizes these probabilities of trajectories in our data set in expectation over our entire data set. So regardless of where the trajectories came from in our data set at different phases of training, whether it came like early in training where agents were maybe behaving randomly, or later in training where they're behaving nearly optimally, we'd like to train these policies that can condition on these behavioral latents, or you can even call them skills, let's say, that somehow are able to reproduce any of that kind of sampled training data.
Just a couple of quick notation. What is capital N?
Capital N is the number of agents.
And how should I think of that integral over Z alpha? Can you give me a little more intuition into that DZ alpha, or the Z alpha term exactly?
Yeah, so this is basically if we have a distribution over our Z alpha and Z omega, which are latent spaces, we're basically saying like over this entire behavioral latent space, we're taking an integral over these sets of continuous variables.
Got it. All right, so I'm drawing one Z omega total and then one Z alpha per agent essentially.
Exactly.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, and then once we have,
sorry, Shayegan. Just I wanted to clarify: does zeta alpha then assume that like each player on a team is like in some way asymmetrical? There's like roles within the players. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, so so in our actual experiments, we ended up learning a shared distribution over the Z alpha. So we did parameter sharing, but you can also decouple those all together. And you can also do the kind of usual tricks of, adding in the agent IDs to allow some level of heterogeneity between the agents. So it's kind of, the framework is really flexible in regards to that.
Cool. Thanks.
Cody?
So is it the case that both the local latent and the joint latent are like fixed throughout time? Because they don't appear to be indexed by time here.
That,
And
yeah,
I
that's a
guess
great-
I'm like, and I assume if the thing you're trying to do is characterize change over time, you'd assume if like we assume that a local latent, corresponds to a behavior, you would expect that to like vary over time, right?
Yeah, so we assume that this Z alpha and Z omega are fixed throughout an episode, but we don't assume that they're fixed throughout training time, right? So for
I
different
see.
trajectories popping up, they could be changing throughout training time.
I see. So we basically run this for a given trajectory, but that trajectory is like representing a given point in time. And that's why, so time here is like episodic time, not training time. Okay.
Yeah, it's both, right? It's both. So each trajectory is coming from some point in training time, but this particular time index here is the usual episodic time. And yeah,
That makes sense.
For a given episode, we just lock those parameters. So basically at the end of the day, every trajectory coming from our data set will be mapped to one particular Z alpha and one particular Z omega. And we're going to visualize and kind of understand the space of all the different Z alphas and Z omegas across the entire training set.
Right. So you learn some kind of like joint encoder or something between all of the.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. This is literally what we do. Yeah. Exactly. So given the previous kind of decomposition of this problem, we can derive a variational lower bound in the usual kind of BAE manner. It's just a kind of hierarchical BAE in this sense. And this bound has three terms. So the first term is basically just saying we'd like to train these reconstructed policies that maximize the log likelihood of the actions that we observed in our training data set. Right, so that's just this first term. The second and third terms are pretty much the same as the kind of usual BAE KL divergence term. So we're training these encoders both at the local level and at the joint level, and these KL divergences are just saying our local encoders should minimize some divergence with respect to our local priors, and similarly, our joint encoders should minimize some divergence with respect to a joint prior. And like in the usual BAE type of setup, joint prior can be fully learned, or we can assume that, let's say, it's like a kind of Gaussian distribution with, let's say, like diagonal covariance or something. But all of these components are being learned basically on the right side here. So the joint prior and encoder are shared for all the agents. So there's one network that is kind of capturing that, and then the local priors and encoders and policies, we can either share the parameters of those between all the agents and kind of condition on, let's say, like one hot IDs of the agents, or we can just have completely decoupled policies and networks being learned there, just to give a little bit of extra flexibility. So given our offline data set, this is the model that we end up training, and we call this model MOBA, which stands for Multi-Agent Offline Hierarchical Behavior Analyzer. All right, so now that we have that set up, how do we actually run experiments? So the workflow is twofold. One is data gathering, and then the second is running offline analysis using MOBA. So for data collection, we just train agents, just to get kind of interesting data, we train agents using off-the-shelf model algorithms. As part of this, we ended up adding multi-agent support to the Acme framework. So that's now open source if you want to check that out. And importantly, we collect trajectories throughout the whole training process, right? So we just want to kind of capture, cast a wide net over all the type of behaviors that we observe from beginning to end of training, multiple seeds, multiple hyperparameters, and so on. That's phase one. Once we have this data, we train MOBA as I just detailed on the previous slide. All right, so now let's dig into some of the results. So just to revisit that earlier, very simple kind of example. Yep, question?
When you get the data, like when you try to like generate trajectories, do you explicitly use some method to like incentivize diversity?
So in this case, no. We just do a pretty wide, again, hyperparameter sweep. So different learning rates. I mean, maybe as just in that sense, yes, but there's no like diversity term in our RL training objective. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, just to go back to this earlier example, basically once we run MOBA, then every single one of the trajectories in our data set, right, maps to one of these kind of latent vectors. And this is a visualization of that latent space, both at the joint level and at the individual agent level. So up here is Z omega, and then down here are Z alphas for each of the agents. And the latents obviously are like high dimensional in these experiments. So this is just a PCA over those, just 2-dimensional visualization of those. So then down here, we see like for the individual agents, obviously right now in the setting, we have a lot of symmetry. So in some of the training runs, some of the agents end up, some of the runs end up converging to the agents preferring one hill over the other. So we have kind of dominant kind of, trimodal kind of distribution, and then some intermediate kind of like when the agents are initially learning how to explore, they're maybe doing some random exploration, some other dots there as well. And that kind of holds for all 3 agents. At the top level, I mean, there's not really any multi-agent interaction happening here. So this is just a kind of combinatorial space, right? All the different combinations of hill preferences that the agents exhibit at the low level, they end up kind of being exposed at the joint level. But we can kind of dig into this a little bit more and take a look at different clusters in this latent space. So let's take a look at the joint level. Taking a look at cluster A here, this basically consists of a bunch of trajectories coming from early phases of training where agents are kind of exhibiting random behaviors going to all the way to the edge of the world. Cluster B here corresponds to one where all 3 of the agents had preferred to go to this top left hill. Cluster C is another one. 2 of the agents, 0 and 2, end up going to the bottom left hill, and 1 of the agents goes to the right hill. And we can do the same thing at the joint level, at the local level. So for agent 1, we have cluster D here. This is the one where it chooses to go to the top left hill at the end of training. Cluster E goes to the bottom left hill. Obviously, there's a third cluster we're not showing for the right hill here for agent 1. And we can do this kind of across all the different agents as well. And then now kind of going back to that earlier kind of training run, kind of motivating example, now imagine if, in addition to our usual training visualization and return curves, we had this kind of behavioral space visualizer as well on the side. So as training is happening, or maybe at the end of training, we can take a look at these trials A and B and visualize where they land in this behavioral space. And so immediately here we can see, between these 2 trials, so trial A is teal, trial B is the pink, agent 1 is the one that ends up at the end of training preferring to go to the same hill and preferring to kind of behave similarly between the 2 trials. And we can see that in the actual trajectories if we roll it out. So agent 1 is always going to the right hill between these 2 trials, and agents 0 and 2 actually show different preferences at the end of training. And we can also see that at the joint level too. As part of this, we also developed some kind of interactive demos too. Hopefully this works. It tends to slow down a little bit for some reason when I'm on Meet, but yeah, it was working. So yeah, we can visualize this also interactively as well. So this is that same latent space. Now we have agents 0, 1, 2. We can start to filter and say, okay, so let's take a look at all the trajectories for agent 0, all the data sets in all the trajectories in our data set for agent 0, where they end up preferring this behavioral kind of latent. So we're taking a look at agent 0 here, which is the blue agent, and in that cluster, basically all the trajectories in our data set are where it prefers this top left hill, right? And we can kind of do this filtering both at the joint level and also at the local level. So for the joint level, maybe we can take a look at this joint cluster, and we can see here, right? So this is the joint cluster, and primarily agent 1 and 2 end up expressing the same behavior. So one mode of behavior, right? These 2 clusters for this joint behavior, but agent 0 actually kind of switches back and forth a little bit, right? So it's going to this cluster and this cluster for this kind of joint behavior. And we can kind of see that down here as well. So most of the trajectories, all agents are going to the top left, but agent 0 sometimes is going to the right. Obviously, also this is a function of the PCA, right? We have high dimensional latents. We're just doing a 2D, capture of that. So there's overlaps between the clusters as well that's happening here. So we can kind of like play around with these types of interactions as well to better understand what's happening in training. Let me just share tabs again. Oh, oops. Yep, there's another tab. Yep, question?
Yeah, so going back to just the goal of like discovering agent behavior, do you think like essentially this kind of plotting out of like both the joint distributions and then like the individual ones, and then just clicking through and being able to see like which ones correspond to which, like, is this how you kind of envision like the best way for kind of discovering behavior relative to instead of kind of manually sampling and like looking at how the behaviors are allowed? Or how do you kind of see this being used for like more complicated experiments?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think the manual analysis will really be the way to use this at the end of the day. The manual analysis is definitely like interesting for like understanding these behavioral clusters and quickly filtering them. But I think some level of automation will end up being useful for this. So imagine if for training different training runs, we actually are like monitoring, jumping of behaviors from one cluster to the other, and we can kind of detect behavioral instability using measures of like how quickly are these things kind of changing behavior between different behavioral clusters. In addition to this, we can also augment this with like reward information. So the visualizations I was showing, actually, some of the labels, the color labels, are actually coming from the reward information. Even though we're not training MOBA and MOBA doesn't observe any reward information, we can still, if we have access to that information, we can augment these visualizations with that info to say like, oh, there's actually some clusters here that have really high reward and some that have low reward, just to help humans kind of reduce the cognitive burden on humans in terms of understanding this space. But I think this is still, I think the idea is like, it's better than manually scraping through hundreds of trajectories and kind of setting up that manual process. So this is kind of one step towards that type of automation.
Understood. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Yeah, so that previous example didn't really have any direct multi-agent interaction. Now what if we have a bit more kind of tighter coordination happening? So here we're considering a kind of simple 2-agent coordination game. So again, they're working in this continuous 2D world. There's 3 regions in this world. There's region A and B, which are these circular regions, and there's region C, which is everything external to those regions. And the objective here is for the agents to first learn how to navigate in this space, and then coordinate to receive the payoffs in the payoff table below. So if basically both of the agents, let's say, learn to navigate to the circle AA, then they would receive a payoff of 1 each. And likewise, like if they both learn to navigate to BB, they receive a payoff of 0. So this kind of structure is also set up in a way to induce a little bit of training instability as well. So imagine if the row player agent 0 chooses strategy B and column player agent 1 chooses strategy A. Well, they're at this joint strategy, and let's say agent 1 starts to now deviate to this strategy. Well, agent 0 is going to receive some 0 reward and maybe think, hey, I'm doing something wrong, and it actually might kind of alter its future distribution as well. So there's a bit of kind of space here for coordination breaking happening too. So now if we run MOBA on this and visualize those latent spaces, we end up seeing at the joint latent space, we have these 3 kind of, more dominant behavioral clusters. And then also this small kind of cluster down here is basically early in training where the agents aren't even moving at all. They're kind of just stuck. And so like if we take and filter by these joint behaviors, so the orange cluster here is where both of the agents end up preferring this AA joint strategy. Blue is where they go to AB, and then green is basically where they reverse. They go to BA.
Excuse me, I have a quick. The agents can observe each other, so they can see what each one is doing in a particular trial?
That's actually a good question. I mean, we ran these experiments a while ago.
Otherwise, I'm not sure how they're coordinating otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, the agents, I don't think in this case they need to. So as long as the policies of the agents are deterministic, if they realize that, hey, as long as I go to A, regardless of what you're doing.
Oh, got it. Yeah, I understand.
You don't need observability. Yeah, I actually can't. Yeah, makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, so actually going back to Jordy's question, so we can also kind of monitor this visualization throughout the training process now. So now we're taking a look at one of the particular original Marl training runs, right? We ran, I think, like 50 different runs to collect the data here. We're just looking at one of them. And we're tracking the progress of training and the behavioral changes in the agents throughout training from 0% training in purple all the way to 100% of training done in yellow. And so here we see that both at the joint level and at the local level, pretty quickly the agents learn to converge to just prefer one of these kind of joint and local behaviors. And then now if we take a look at a different training run, we actually notice that there's a bit of oscillation happening, right? So at the joint level, they end up kind of switching back and forth between preferring one joint behavior over the other over time. And now the kind of cool thing about MOBA is that there's this coupling between the joint behavioral space and local behavior space. So every joint behavior latent has a matching local behavior latent. So now we can dig in and say, okay, it actually looks like agent 0 converged quickly to preferring one of those 2 circular regions, but it was agent 1 that ended up flipping back and forth and kind of changing its mind over time. So this type of kind of debugging maybe can be helpful. Let's say like we have like some issue in the training process. It can help us to kind of zoom in and kind of better understand what's happening here. All right, so then we start to go a little bit larger scale and higher dimension state action spaces. So here we're considering a 2-agent half cheetah environment. One agent is controlling the back leg, the hind leg of the agent. One is controlling the front leg of the cheetah, and the objective is to go forward in the X direction here. And for this one, I'm going to pop up again this question.
Yeah, so quick question. So you're initializing every trial in the same way, right? There's no difference here.
In the MuJoCo case, you mean?
No, in the previous cases. I was just wondering if there's a relationship between how you initialize each trial and the eventual behavior that the agents.
Yeah, so the trials also have different seeds for all of the neural network policies of the agents themselves, right? So there's initial kind of randomization that is coming from the neural network policies as well. So that can actually induce some preference over, one behavior over the other. Yeah, so the policies of the agents are not identical at the beginning of these trials. Does that help answer the question?
Thank you.
Okay, so now let's dig into the MuJoCo space. And then, as I mentioned earlier, so despite the fact that we don't pass any of the reward information to MOBA, it's kind of interesting. It does end up discovering these clusters that do have high returns. So like clearly here is a high return. And this is like pretty intuitive, right? Like rewards and returns are a function of state action. So like if you have very disparate kind of state action trajectories, you're also going to have kind of these clusters that have near optimal behaviors and high rewards, and these other clusters that have lower rewards. And so like we can do that type of filtering in here. So maybe like we can take a look at this joint behavior in MuJoCo and take a look at the trajectories from that cluster. So here, there's a certain kind of running gate that the agent has converged to. It's fairly high reward. And then there's kind of other lower reward ones, like there's one here, kind of a different running gate. The front leg is a bit more, I don't know, like pogo stick, like, and then there's obviously like kind of much lower return trajectories up here. The agent is basically learning to just flip, forward. Yeah, there's tons of kind of, I think, room here to like explore and kind of derive like better methods for automating this type of analysis process, but this is kind of that first step. All right, and then we wanted to kind of finish off with going really big. So one question was, what if we now not just use policies that we trained ourselves? What if we use externally trained policies? So we went back to that OpenAI hide and seek domain. And just as a quick overview in a little bit more detail, so this is a domain involving 4 agents, two hiders and 2 seekers. There's interactive ramps and boxes in the environment, a very much larger state action space, or actually, I guess, action observation space, 100-dimensional observation per agent, 5-dimensional actions per agent. And then each episode here that we're passing into MOBA has 200 decision steps. And then in the simulator itself, OpenAI uses 15 action repeats just to give you like a bit more like higher fidelity time dimension in simulation. And kindly, OpenAI had open sourced both their simulator and also some of those policy checkpoints that they had manually annotated in their paper. So we basically grabbed those policy checkpoints and ran them through the simulator. We collected a bunch of trajectories over that, and then we shuffled all of these trajectories coming from these 4 different policies together into one big data set. And then we ran this whole data set through MOBA. And this is the behavior space that MOBA learns from this data set. So basically, I mean, the level of disentanglement is not as clear as it was in those much simpler kind of toy examples, but we do still get a level of separation, both at the joint level. So all the points in the different colors correspond to the raw policies, the human annotated policies used by OpenAI. So there's kind of a clear separation of those here. And then especially, for some of the agents, right, there is a level of disentanglement happening for like the running and chasing behavior of some of the seekers, for example. So, I mean, this is kind of a way to show that, hey, maybe there is room to actually automate that type of like human in the loop manual annotation process, even in these extremely large, high dimensional type of settings. Yeah, so that's basically the end of the talk. Yeah, Ola.
On the previous slide, how did you label the colors of the clusters? Was that manually labeled to visualize, or did you have a way to label those colors?
Okay, so so basically we first grab the 4 policies that are available on GitHub corresponding to these 4 human annotated behaviors coming from OpenAI. We shuffle all of that data together, all the trajectory data from all of these policies. We run MOBA, and then we grab the latents and project them via PCA here. And then the coloring, we use just the human labels for the coloring. So these colors correspond to the expert labels that OpenAI had for these trajectories. MOBA itself doesn't observe these labels. Colors are just coming from the humans. Yeah, so in this work, we introduced this method for multi-agent behavior analysis called MOBA. It stands for Multi-Agent Offline Hierarchical Behavior Analyzer. Our method is fairly general in the sense that it assumes no knowledge of the agent's underlying training algorithms. They're models. We don't need access to their actual policies, just trajectories. We don't need access to their hidden states and so on. We also don't need access to the underlying raw multi-agent environment. So we don't need to be able to interact with that environment live. We just need kind of offline trajectory data. We don't assume any labeling or policy identifiers for this underlying data. Obviously, if we had that, things would be way easier. We don't assume that. And finally, MOBA applies to reward-free settings as well. So even if we have kind of human-human type of interaction data or human agent, human robot interactive settings, as long as we have trajectory data, we can run it through MOBA and understand these kind of like different coordinated behaviors. But I think kind of the more important takeaway from this talk is we generate a ton of data when we train moral agents. And most of the time, we just end up throwing away that data. All the intermediate data ends up getting thrown away. Or maybe it's stored somewhere, but nobody really accesses it. But maybe actually by analyzing that data, we can actually gain some useful insights about the training processes and behaviors of agents that we might have otherwise missed. And so let's bring attention towards developing tools for doing this type of systematic analysis of behavioral data, because maybe we can not just understand our agents better, but hopefully even improve them in the future as well. Yeah, thank you so much for all the great questions and for attending the talk. I think we have a few minutes left as well. Happy to take more questions.
Yeah, thanks so much again for coming. I guess we do have some time for some questions. We have a fair number of folks here, so if you want to ask a question, maybe we just go with the hand-raising procedure, and we'll go from there. So I'll give folks a second to raise their hand if they want to ask a question. So Cody and then Jordy.
I'm curious if you've tried any like different structures on the the latent learning part of things. Like for example, doing like a VQ GAN or like a quantization step or something, which might lead to like better clusters of space.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I briefly experimented with that, like at the tail end of when we were submitting the paper. That was kind of the idea as well, was like, can we disentangle the clusters a bit more clearly doing that? I didn't delve deep enough into it to kind of stabilize that training, like explore that space enough, but I think it would give better results. Like if you're really looking for the separation, I'd be really curious to see what happens, especially with like the OpenAI experiments with that.
I had a similar question on just like how could we improve like the latent space to make it easier to disentangle like the behaviors?
I guess Manfred then.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great talk, Shayegan. I was wondering when you were presenting the work you were talking about, like one of the perceived benefits of this analysis is seeing like the emerging behaviors or the different emerging behaviors. I was wondering, how do you think that this work may inform in the reverse way? Once that you have your analysis out of MOBA, how do you make sure that you can induce the type of behaviors that you would like to see that you're not getting from the analysis?
Yeah, so that was basically like the idea of that meta policies, I think, is linked to that, where after you do this analysis, let's say as a human, you go in and understand these types of different behavioral clusters. Now, let's say you start to train a brand new agent. You have some crazy new algorithm, state of the art. You want to test it out in this new environment, but you know that there's certain types of behaviors in this environment that you never want the agent to exhibit, right? Maybe it has some like adversarial behaviors. It just like, goes against the user or something. You never want it to exhibit that. Then what you can maybe do is, as the agent is training, if it's exhibiting those behaviors, you can on the side be passing those trajectories into MOBA and detect whenever that cluster is basically being exhibited in terms of that behavior by the agent. And if you detect that, one way to do this is just to feed back information and kind of negative reward to the training pipeline to try to kind of squash that negative behavior. That's one way. Another way might be to now, instead of training like usual low-level policies, to train a meta policy over this behavior space, which is, instead of sampling actions, it's sampling different behavior latents. And so this meta policy is itself kind of exploring this behavioral latent space. And then there's kind of interesting questions of what's happening, in regions of this behavior space where we actually didn't have any training data. Is this space kind of smooth? And we had some early experiments on this, like here, where we're sampling from the behavior space on these kind of 2D and it's fairly smooth space. So you can basically like be sampling from these regions where we have never collected any training data, and you can generate trajectories. Because the cool thing with MOBA is you have this reconstructed policy term. So given whatever latent you're sampling, you can push that through the policy, and if you have access to the environment, you can actually roll out these behaviors. So you can do things like this, like where you're like sampling behavior for one agent, going into the spiral for a circle. These are obviously like kind of, there's a one-to-one mapping between the latent space and behavior space. So it's kind of like the kind of polar coordinates matchup emerges directly here, but it is kind of interesting to explore this, I think, in higher dimensional settings too. So these are different ways I think that we can explore that latent space and feedback signals to the original policy.
Makes sense. Thank you.
This is more of a comment than a question. But I think one thing that's really interesting to me that I'm curious if you've thought much about as a use of it is, in kind of general sum game settings, it kind of matters what partners you play with for the final partner that you get. And so like post hoc, like you kind of see this in Sophie GT, where they have to pick a particular set of partners that they play with so that the agent comes out like exactly a particular amount of aggressiveness. And it feels like if you're trying to run that procedure, you do some kind of diversity-based training, and then you want to select out which policies are the ones that you should be playing with in the future, but you don't you maybe have 100 diverse agents, you don't know which ones to pick out. So it just seemed like an interesting application, and I thought I would bring it up as like post hoc, helping you filter down a list of candidate policies from a much bigger set that you've trained.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool application. Like kind of like the training process is meant to capture that a little bit as well. Where like we have this ideally, reconstructed policy that is able to express agents at various skill levels coming from any point in training, and maybe in those type of settings, like if you feel almost like a curriculum set up for helping agents learn. Yeah, I think that's a really great application of this. We haven't explored that space, but if people want to try that, yeah, I would be really happy to see it. I think there's tons of stuff we can do in this space, honestly. There's also connections to like the notions of skill learning that are happening as well here. This is basically a skill, like the latent space here is a space of skills in some way, except, the skills here are not necessarily always useful, right? Like getting skills from different points of training. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a really good comment.
I think the curriculum learning point that you raised is also pretty good. But since we have you for a few more minutes, I thought I would ask, whether you have any thoughts on, if you wanted to use this as some kind of debugging tool. And I know that's like maybe the long-term perspective. Like, how would you think about building this like out as a tool for debugging agents or in multi-agent systems?
Yeah. So like one caveat with using this as a debugging tool is that you need to have something where you like start off with some existing data set of like enough coverage of your behavior space, right? Like you need to have enough coverage of the behavior space if you want to use this for future training runs, to be able to like understand, you know, whether certain behaviors are emerging or not. And like that's one kind of open question right now is, what if we set this up in a streaming fashion? So like as training is happening in the underlying moral algorithm, we're also streaming and training MOBA online as well, and seeing how this behavior space changes and evolves over time. So that's, I think, one useful thing that would come as you know, as a follow-up to this, if we can set up a streaming version of this. And then I think another important factor with debugging is just like that human interactive and UX and reducing the cognitive load for humans. I don't know how folks here tend to debug their you know, RL algorithms, but I often find myself like just doing printouts and just scraping through trajectories manually. You know, sometimes just like doing a straight up print of state action pairs and rewards, you know, in small settings actually works pretty well. But yeah, the number of hours being spent on that type of debugging, I think, is like, can be shocking if you like step back and look at it. So hopefully some tools, it doesn't necessarily have to be MOBA, but tools like this hopefully can help out with that process someday.
Yeah, I didn't mean to put it in the debugging box, but I often think about how like primitive the RL debugging process is, and even worse in multi-agent settings. And so it seemed like maybe an interesting direction.
Yeah,
but also one for bringing like domain expertise in the sense of, you know, providing the labels for how to classify the trajectories, and they're like what clusters should look like in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, if you have access to human labels as well, maybe you can actually feed that into MOBA as another auxiliary signal to try to help further disentangle, right? Like if we actually use the policy labels in those OpenAI experiments to learn a space that is like where there's clear separation of these clusters, that might actually be even more helpful, right?
I also have to run, and I'm going to stop the recording now, but I just want to say thanks again for this fantastic talk. This is really great.
No, thank you for the invitation.